2. So the last time we looked at Nehemiah, we were focusing in on the first 9 verses of chapter 2 and watching as Nehemiah was waiting for the right time to share his burden, his vision with his boss, everyone's boss at that time, King Artaxerxes. Nehemiah wants to see the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. And we talked about this being a great risk, even thinking about asking it. Number one, because this is the same king who had not long before decreed no rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. And number two, this is a man whose job is to be the cupbearer, and it's a high-level security job, and not easy to find a summer substitute for a cupbearer that you can trust. So a lot of reasons from an earthly standpoint that Nehemiah is going to be cautious when he makes these requests. And we spent some time last week talking about how important it was we could see to Nehemiah to not only think it through what he was going to say, but more importantly, to pray about what he was going to say. And even when the king asked him, "What's on your heart?" You seem down, in his kind of diary way, Nehemiah said, I just stopped and prayed to God, and that was probably a big help me now to know what to say and for the king to accept this, and he did. And so now it's time for action. So we see time and again throughout the scriptures that just in the lives of people that love God that are recorded in this word, but in our own lives, when God wants to do something through us and he's given us either a specific task to do, or just more importantly, we're trying to grow closer to him, Satan meets that movement with his own resistance. And Satan's forces are going to resist us and fight us tooth and nail. That's exactly what begins here in verse 10 of chapter 2. Allow me to introduce our two villains. There'll be one more later to come tonight. But verse 10, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. So Sanballat the Horonite, he was the governor of Samaria. You've heard of Samaria. Horonite tells us where Sanballat was from. He would have been given authority by the Persian king, King Artaxerxes, so he's under his rule. And this, again, is the same king that says no rebuilding of any walls. Sanballat is probably an old man by the time that this is taking place. His sons are acting on his behalf at this time. Tobiah, his name in Hebrew means God is good, but sadly, it's an ironic name because at least at this point in his life, he's not close to God. He doesn't even know God as far as we know. He is probably a junior colleague of Sanballat's, but to get a sense of these two guys' anger, we see earlier in King Artaxerxes' reign, they had complained about what was happening with some Jews trying to restore the walls of Jerusalem, and they came to king, and the king said, okay, stop it. He put out a decree. So here Nehemiah shows up trying to do the same thing, he got a green light from the king, and they worked so hard through their legislation to get this thing shut down. So we already have this shower on these guys' political and personal parade. They're not happy with this. And it's really true when you think about the church today. Years ago, if you would have had a neighborhood being built, and then not long after a church was being built in it, that was seen as a really good thing. A church was a positive part of a community. It was really, in certain times, like the bedrock of the community. But now, and this has been going on for a while, churches are not seen as assets. They're actually seen as liabilities to communities. Now, some of that is you have these communities that exist, and here comes someone that just bought 40 acres of land, and they have a monstrosity of a church they want to build, and they're just thinking of all the headaches that come with it. But deeper than that is the notion that churches are not positive because we're living in a post-Christian society. We're living in a place where Christianity isn't seen as positive. It's seen to a number of people like just another cult, you know. Scientology, Christianity, you name it, it's all kind of the same. So let's look at how a leader like Nehemiah is going to tackle this huge building project as well as resist getting tackled by this opposition. And I think as we look at what Nehemiah does, one way that I'm trying to apply it in my life is to see how to be a wiser worker for the Lord. What are things I need to do to wisely work for God? And the first thing that we see a wise worker doing in Nehemiah is something that seems like not the first thing you'd see in verse 11 and 12, and that is a wise worker recharging his batteries. Now, literally, there were no batteries back then, but you know what I mean. Nehemiah is getting closer to Jerusalem, and I think the closer he gets, he can understand why Hanani, if you want to pronounce it that way, had been so dejected when he came as a messenger to Susa to tell Nehemiah about the disrepair of the walls. And now Nehemiah is overwhelmed as he's seeing the city's shattered walls and its useless gates. And Nehemiah is a man of action. He's a guy that wants to get things done. So just seeing how bad things were, I think his first inclination would have been drop camp wherever he needs to and let's start on these walls. But he doesn't do that. He, first of all, decides to rest. I mean, part of it is how incredibly hard this journey must have been for him. Because it wasn't like a one-day journey. Because the journey took around 4 months, we think, from where he was to Jerusalem's walls. And so verse 11 says, "So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. And that journey had already involved traveling through hostile territory. They traveled probably about 9 or 10 hours a day, miles a day, not hours. His group would have been camping every night, and in that particular part of the world, they would be getting up as close to dawn as they could and traveling as long as they could before that sun, that Middle Eastern sun, just became unbearable, and they had to make camp wherever they were. And I think it's such a great example to us about when we're physically exhausted, we can be setting ourselves up for failure. One reason it's true is because if we're living in this physical state of exhaustion for a while, it can rob us of having clear thinking on things. I remember all of us have had experiences where we've gone without much sleep and we begin to see things and hear things and think things and not sound as clear as we'd like to be. If you've ever seen on any of the channels the documentary about what they call Hell Week, not the motorcycle guys, but the Navy SEAL training, and all that they put them through, in that coast of San Diego where they do that, and it's brutal. And every time a guy drops out of the training, or he rings a bell, or they ring a bell. And so psychologically, they're going days without sleep, and they're hearing that bell, and that bell sounds like mom's dinner bell, just go home. And every time the bell rings, one of their trainers will go, okay, go ahead and go back to mom. Someone gave up. This is a good time for you to give up. And there's one part of a documentary I saw where they were on the beaches of San Diego at night, and they hadn't had sleep for days. And finally, the trainer orders them to go lay down and sleep. And there's no one of those potential SEALs having a tough time falling asleep. It's like that. They're gone. But the trainer is talking to the cameraman. He said, look at their bodies. And he said, look how they twitch. They were just like, they had been so sleep deprived. He said, we know physiologically about how long we can push them before we're going to start seeing them break down physically and get serious injuries, and they're going to do really stupid things, and we don't want them doing that. So I think, I've never been that tired, although I've met a couple of guys that either tried out or trained for the SEALs or were SEALs, and That's a whole different breed. But I think about a story like 1 Kings chapter 18, the story of Elijah at Mount Carmel. And you know it. I won't go into the details as much as just to remind you that it's this great showdown where God is going to show how he is the only true God, and the prophets of Baal are going to show, and they're thinking that Baal is the true God. And so the prophets of Baal, start dancing around the altar, and then they're cutting themselves and trying to get the attention of the God. And then Elijah, man, he just starts making the most cruel, sarcastic jokes on them. One of them in the original language is basically, maybe your God's in the bathroom and can't help you right now, which I think is just so mean and terrible, but hilarious, as these guys, they're not going to get any help because Baal isn't a thing. So then they're done, and then, Elijah has them dig the trench, keep putting water in. He's making this impossible for them to say some sort of a weird thing happening in the desert where all of a sudden the fire takes place. And God just, in his answer to Elijah's prayer, consumes the sacrifice of the altar and licks up all the water. But it's not over there. I'm always amazed after that, because Elijah then goes in and kills all of those prophets. So, if you're on a mountaintop with God and you're running on pure adrenaline, that's Elijah. And then when you get in, turn to 1 Kings 19, because I'm always just wondering if this is the same guy. It seems like it should be. Because he comes off this high, this spiritual high, this battle royale, one-on-one between Baal and God shows who's God. And then we see at the beginning of 19, Ahab comes back and tells the power woman Jezebel all that Elijah had done. Can't you hear him whining to Jezebel? And how he killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So may the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." And you're thinking, you and whose army? I just killed all your prophets. You are going to be a problem? But look at verse 3. Then he was afraid. And he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. He just took off. Now, I love what James writes in James 5:17 when he says Elijah was a person just like us. Although none of us are going to have that kind of experience that he just did. But boy, I remember that saying by the great football legendary coach Vince Lombardi, that fatigue makes cowards of us all. And Elijah's just spent. You're thinking, why in the world would you be afraid? But I love what God does. If you look in verses 6 and 7, instead of rebuking Elijah, he loves on him. And so, Elijah's being fed now, miraculously fed. And it says that he ate and drank and lay down again in verse 6. In verse 7, and the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." So God, instead of rebuking him, says, just take a break, rest. You're beyond stressed right now. Get some perspective. And I think one thing God's giving him perspective on is, just as I'm miraculously feeding you now, I've taken care of you all your life, Elijah. You have nothing to be afraid of. And I love that he tells Elijah in those verses 2 times to eat and sleep, eat and sleep. Now, if you're like Dagwood in the cartoon, what was that cartoon called? Blondie, where he was always, his back was to you, he was on the couch taking a nap when his wife was telling him to do something. Some people, the last thing they need to do is eat and sleep, eat and sleep. That's what their problem is. They eat and sleep too much. But in this instance, we're talking about people that are just running on nothing. There's a great story in Mark 6 where the disciples had been doing all this great work, meeting the needs of so many people, And Jesus could tell, because it says in Mark 6, the disciples hadn't even eaten for a while. And Jesus says, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. So sometimes the most important thing we can do in service to God is make sure, like we were talking about Sunday and last Wednesday, that rhythm, that rest of interaction and withdrawal, that's that creational rhythm that we see. So that's the first thing Nehemiah does. He rests. The second thing he does is receive spiritual direction. Look at verse 12 of Nehemiah 2. Then I arose in the night, and I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one in which I rode. So even the valued people that Nehemiah was going to be working with didn't know really what was on Nehemiah's heart and mind at this time. He was still letting it simmer in him like a crock pot, just kind of stewing in a good way and asking God to continue to improve his thoughts and his plans. And the Hebrew language here gives us the sense that Nehemiah has this continual communication and communion with God. That phrase in verse 12 could read, what my God had continually put in my heart to do. Nehemiah just didn't put a plan together and then he was done and let's go do this. Nehemiah was constantly checking in with God. Let's make sure I'm doing the right thing, God. He's on his knees in prayer. And I think that's a challenge for us all. Because to back up to the rest thing, a lot of times you'll talk to people that say, yeah, I know I need to rest. Man, I'm worn out. I'm tired. But they're not doing anything about it. Rest is something that has to be planned. Usually free time doesn't walk up to you, knock on your door and say, hi, I'm free time. You have to take me now. It's something that you have to plan. And our culture encourages and enables hurry sickness because you're to be doing and moving to the next thing. And we see other cultures that are really good about resting. I've talked to people, a man in my church in Florida is with the Lord now, but he was stationed, I believe, in Greece in part of the time in the Navy. And some of those other cultures, the Greek culture did this where they would work and then they would take a big siesta and then they would eat a late dinner and then keep working, which is really just different from the way we do things. But they built in that time where everyone had to shut down and get their rest. So that's what Nehemiah is doing. He's carving out this important space that he needs not just for physical rest, but spiritual renewal, because he's got a huge job in front of him. So that's what a wise worker is, a person that recharges their batteries. Next, look at Nehemiah. He also assesses his needs. And we see this in verses 13 through 16. He said, I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate. And I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under for me to pass. Verse 15. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall. And I turned back and entered by the valley gate and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. And I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were going to be doing the work with him. So recharging time's over, and now Nehemiah is evaluating, what do I need to do? What needs to be done? And again, verse 12 reminds us he had not really talked with his partners, potential partners, on what he had in mind to do. Now, Nehemiah could have chosen to do this all by himself. But he, instead of being independent, chose to be interdependent. He greatly valued the experience and the knowledge and the opinions and even the reliability of these other good men that were with him. And that's just a lesson. Some of us are really good about gathering others around us to help us in work. Others, like me, I'm the kind of guy that just will do it alone and then hit a wall and think, boy, I should have gotten help with that. And part of that's just an impatience thing. But I've always thought that it's really great to watch people that are just naturally gifted, or they make themselves bring in people to kind of get their handprints all over the plan with them. So it's a community, a group project. Because three things we learned about this mission: it was going to be a demanding mission. He's surveying each section of the wall, looking at every detail of the repairs that need to be organized effectively. And I think for us, that means when we're going to do something for God in our personal lives or together as a church, we have to understand it's going to be a demanding mission. It's going to be hard. This was also a hazardous mission. The reason he traveled at night is to be undercover, knowing that these enemies of his, they were ready to frustrate his plans. And so he has to keep things on the down low. He hadn't informed even the local officials of his plans at this stage. So he'll catch everybody up later, but right now he doesn't want this plan to be sabotaged. And yet there's one person, I guess you could say, being or group of beings that have their eyes on Nehemiah at this point, and it is Satan and his minions, demons. They do not want this to happen. And I think that carries over to us as a church. Because anything that God wants us to do for him, anything God wants us to do as a church, Satan is all about resisting that. And it will come out sometimes in ways we're not even connecting that it's resistance from the enemy. And also, it was a cooperative mission. Only by examining the walls could Nehemiah understand both the personnel he needed as well as the resources to get this job done. So far we see Nehemiah is recharging his batteries. Now he's moving to assess the need. But he doesn't stop there. It's easy for us to say, yep, we've got great needs. But just believe God and pray that God will do it. And God's like, well, pray, yes, but keep going. Keep moving. And the next thing he does is what is hard for some of us to do. In verse 17, he asks for help. Nehemiah brings together this large group of potential partners. He's a great administrator. And verse 17 gives us three truths we can learn about asking others to help us. First of all, Nehemiah identified with his workers. Verse 17 at the beginning, then I said to them, you see the trouble. What's the next word? We are in. Chapter 1, verse 2, it was their trouble, because that's not where Nehemiah was. He was a long way away from Jerusalem. But now it's not their trouble, it's our trouble. It's our issue. And he owns the pain of Jerusalem and feels as intensely about its disrepair as if he lived there his entire life. And then what he does so greatly here in the rest of verse 17 is he gives this entire problem a spiritual perspective. He said, you see the trouble we're in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Yeah, we see that, Nehemiah. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. He's telling us that this is a trouble, and the problem is the Jerusalem lies in ruins, the gates are burned. But more important to Nehemiah than the physical desolation is the spiritual disgrace this is, that the walls look like this. The sad state of Jerusalem's walls could easily be seen and interpreted by the enemies of the people of God as, look, God abandoned all these rebellious people years ago. Give up on it. God's done with you. He's turned his back. So what Nehemiah is doing to fire up his helpers is, this isn't just about getting walls up. This is about so that God's name and fame and reputation are lifted high. This is about him. And that's just such a great truth for us to be reminded of, that it wasn't enough that Nehemiah knew what God's people were supposed to be doing. Nehemiah also understood, more importantly, why God's people needed to rebuild these walls. And I keep drawing this back to church, but I think in church, over time, especially if you've been in the same church, you can think, if someone from the outside comes in and says, why do you do this? You do this, you have this ministry. And especially a church of this age, you can say, and maybe you give the mission statement. This ministry of the church exists and we do this. Great. So let's evaluate that program. If you want it to be doing this, is it doing that? And it's easy just to say, leave it alone. We've always done it this way. And you've heard some of the worst things a church can say is, we ain't never done it this way before. But you're going to get a new pastor, and he may have some new ideas of things to do. And so that's why it's good to evaluate all of your ministries and first of all say, why is this ministry a ministry? And is it something we need to do? Yes or no? And if we say yes, then, is it meeting that goal? Well, no. Well, how can we turn things around so it can? Or is this ministry something we should be doing? And after discussions, really, no. Sometimes the best thing you can do for a program is to give it a proper burial. Have a nice service for it. See you later. You've been around for a long time, but it's not what we're supposed to be doing. So my challenge to you as a church is, don't allow yourself to exist with the status quo. Have this hunger, this ruthlessness in your evaluating the things that you're doing. And why are we doing these things? Every ministry needs to be able to say, here's the purpose of this ministry, and here's how we are going to accomplish that purpose. And that's important. It's always, I think, important to reevaluate. Now, I'm not saying, we meet on Sunday mornings. Well, let's reevaluate that. Do we really need to get together? Some things are a given. You need to be getting together. Don't forsake the assembling of yourselves. And, do we need to have music? Maybe no music. Some things are really important that God's people have been doing for a long time. But you know what I mean, certain little things. And you all have been around church, some of you longer than me, and you know that there have been battles in churches, maybe not this one, over carpet color and over whatever. And people get, they grab onto something, and really at the end of the day, it's no longer about the carpet color. It's just, I'm standing my ground here, and don't push it back on me. That happens all the time. Every church I've been a part of has those struggles. So Nehemiah calls for immediate action. Look at this. He says, come, let's rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so that it will no longer be a disgrace, both to God's people and to God, most importantly. So before these people can respond to this call, Nehemiah is going to now give them assurance for all his gifts that someone greater than Nehemiah is behind them. Nehemiah is a great leader, and he's going to make mistakes we'll see later in the story. Big ones. But we see in verse 18 that Nehemiah inspired confidence in the people that were working with him. He says, and I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, let's rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. He does what a gifted leader should do, and that is not just say, we're doing this because I got the green light from the king and the queen. No, Nehemiah says the reason we're doing this, the reason we're able to do this is because God's in control. He's sovereign. He's the only God. And Nehemiah knows if God's working through him, there's no one that can truly resist them and get away with it. So he says, let's start rebuilding. But every wise worker is going to experience the next thing that we get here in verses 19 and 20. Everyone who's doing God's work is going to have to handle opposition. We move from the devious duo of Sanballat and Tobiah to the troublesome trio of Sanballat, Tobiah, and a guy named Geshem the Arab. He joins the other two men, and they all are very vocal in their hatred of Nehemiah and his workers. So first of all, look at the attack in verse 19. Nehemiah's enemies, first of all, mocked his team. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us. They used their most deadly weapon, their tongues, to make fun of them, to to hurl insults at them. And Jesus will years later say in Matthew 5, hey, God blesses you. I was thinking about these words today and just letting them soak in. God blesses you when you are mocked and persecuted and lied about because you are my followers. Rejoice in it. Be glad. For a great reward awaits you in heaven. And remember, the ancient prophets, and here we go back into this time, they were persecuted too. So I don't think we ever want to rejoice that we're being mocked when we deserve to be mocked, if we're doing something really stupid. But when we're doing God's work and we're doing it his way and we know we're doing what's right, Jesus says it's not if you will be resisted, it's you will. And you're going to suffer from me. And that's not just physical. Here there's no physical suffering. There's some threats, but they're just making fun of them. And then Nehemiah's enemies questioned, not only mocked his team, but they questioned his motives. Look at the end of verse 19. What is this thing that you're doing? And then they get political. Are you rebelling against the king? I'm going to tell the teacher on you. And this allegation, though, has bite because as far as these men know, the king ordered them to stop rebuilding the city. He called these people a rebellious people. So this is a very crafty charge because these men were trying to intimidate God's people with the threat of Persian power, which was the power in that day. And like, really, Nehemiah, you want to tick off the king again? So what's the response in verse 20? Well, first of all, Nehemiah defended the integrity of God. He says, then I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper. Again, it was God who put this passion in Nehemiah's heart, and it's going to be God who ultimately turns this rubble of a wall into a real fortress again, something great he's going to do through his people. God reminds us through instances like this, that God is a jealous God. He will not share his glory with anyone else. And that's what Nehemiah is all about. Nehemiah is about God's glory. And that's what God is wanting to do through us as a church. He wants us as a church to be able to say we are loving each other and we're loving those outside the walls of this place, so that when people drive by, they're not reminded, oh, wow, that church split 2 years ago, or, man, I have been, my first church I was ever an associate pastor in, I was 24, and this church had such a bad reputation in Chicagoland that eventually, years after I left, a new pastor came in, and he made a wise decision. He changed the name of the church, and he changed the location, because the name of that church was a laughing stock, because they owed everybody money and were paying no one for stuff they'd had done, among many other things. So it is easy for a church to have a bad reputation for doing things they shouldn't be doing. So thankfully, that's not Putman Baptist Church, and we want to continue to be sensitive, though, that the enemy wants that to happen. That's what he wants. So Nehemiah, first of all, defends God's integrity, but he also defends his workers' integrity. Look at the end of verse 20. And we, his servants, will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. So Nehemiah has this solidarity with these people, and their issues are his issues. They serve together. And as for the three stooges, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, he said, you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. You are going to be, and they will be, a surrounding threat to this work. And this is not the end of what they're going to do. Sanballat is probably motivated by being threatened politically. Tobiah is probably offended because he had nothing to do with the Jewish religion. This was a cult of sorts to him. Geshem probably stood to lose things financially if this wall gets rebuilt and Jerusalem becomes a strong city again. So, regardless, Nehemiah was so wise not to have anything to do with them. Sometimes it's real easy, and I've made this mistake as a pastor, in a small church, when someone new comes in, that maybe they have an impressive job outside of here, or you know that they're coming from somewhere else and they are really great at whatever and they can really help you, it's real easy to let someone in too quick. And the Bible talks about in Timothy and Titus the qualifications for an elder and then the qualifications for a deacon. And it's interesting, there's only two differences between those two offices in the church that Paul tells us. And the two differences between an elder and a deacon: an elder has to be apt to teach, and that's able to teach doctrine. Doesn't have to be the greatest teacher in the world, but able to teach. And number two, he can't be a new convert. And I have seen churches not give people time enough to prove themselves before they say, come on in and serve as a deacon. Well, brother so-and-so served in this church down the road for so long. See if they're really a part of what you're doing, and if they have the humility to sit and to be part of the body, because quite frankly, my experience with small churches now for the last 30 years is small churches can be a magnet for people who want to get into power quickly. They know they're not going to jump down to First Baptist Spartanburg and, be a deacon in week 2. But small churches they see is I can wiggle in here, and some people just sadly want to be in control. They want power. And so be sensitive as church to make sure that you're not joining hands with anybody that has not proven themselves. And Nehemiah knows these guys are up to no good, and he stays set apart from them, separated from them. I was reading this, talks about observatories. There's a famous one in Los Angeles. In some movies, it's used. It's this gigantic up on this hill. And this person was writing, when an observatory is about to be built, the site selected is always on some high mountain. And the aim is to find a place where there is a clear, unobstructed view of the heavens. And this writer was thinking that, making a really good connection, that in a similar way, faith requires a heavenly vision, and it requires the higher ground of holiness and separation, the pure sky of a consecrated life. And that's what God's doing through this team of people here. They are focused on God's holiness. They're dedicated to living holy lives in response to that. They're dedicated to doing what God's calling them to do, and it's going to be very difficult. One of the things that will stand out to us later is that it's not like they're going to get paid to be working on the wall, that they have regular jobs and then they have to work on the wall on top of that. Some of them, I think, left their jobs to do this. So this was a huge undertaking, but they knew they were doing it for God's glory, which is the greatest thing. So that's Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 10 through 20, and then we'll dive in. I think next week's, is it, we're eating over here? Is that what next week is? Next Wednesday? So I'll do a shortened talk, which you'll be thankful for. Next week on Nehemiah 3, we'll go into that. Let's close in prayer. God, thank you so much for your word. Thank you, God, for